The first gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Gunnison, Colorado, in the summer of 1875, but it wasn't the last. Kieran McAllister rode into town with nothing but the clothes on his back, a weathered Colt revolver, and memories that haunted him like ghosts. He hadn't planned to stay. Gunnison was just another stop on an aimless journey that had stretched across 5 states since the war. But fate had other plans, written in blood and tears on that scorching August afternoon. The town wasn't much different from others that had sprung up across the west, a main street lined with wooden storefronts, a saloon doing steady business regardless of the hour, and people trying to carve out lives in a land that could be as merciless as it was beautiful. Kieran had seen it all before. What he hadn't seen was the desperation in young Tommy Jackson's eyes as he ran down the street, pursued by 3 men with murder in their expressions. Kieran had just hitched his horse outside the general store when he spotted the boy, no more than 10 years old, clutching something to his chest as he darted between wagons. The men following him weren't bothering to hide their intentions, one already drawing his pistol. "Stop that thieving brat." The largest of the men shouted, his face red with exertion and anger. Instinct took over before thought could intervene. Kieran stepped into the street, directly in the boy's path. The child collided with him, looking up with terror-stricken eyes. "Please, mister," the boy gasped. "They're gonna kill me." "Get behind me," Kieran said quietly, positioning himself between the child and the approaching men. The leader of the group, a burly man with a pockmarked face, slowed his pace, assessing Kieran with narrowed eyes. His 2 companions spread out slightly, hands hovering near their weapons. "That's Blackwell's boy," the leader spat. "Caught him stealing from my store. Step aside, stranger. This ain't your concern." Kieran didn't move. "How much did he take?" "That ain't the point," the man growled. "Boy needs to learn a lesson." "I'll pay for whatever he took," Kieran offered, maintaining a calm demeanor while noting the positions of all 3 men. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and he could feel the familiar tension building, the prelude to violence he'd known too many times before. The man laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Too late for that. Blackwells have been nothing but trouble since they arrived. Time to send a message." When the first man reached for his gun, Kieran moved with the fluid precision born of too many similar encounters. His revolver cleared its holster in a smooth motion, but he didn't aim to kill, not immediately. His first shot struck the ground at the leader's feet, a warning. "Walk away," Kieran advised, his voice steady. "Whatever the boy did, it's not worth dying over." For a moment, it seemed they might heed his warning. Then the second man, younger and clearly impulsive, drew and fired. Kieran felt the bullet tear through the flesh of his left arm but managed to stay upright. His return fire was not as merciful, striking the young gunman in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. What followed was a blur of motion and noise. The leader and the third man both fired, forcing Kieran to dive behind a water trough, pushing the boy down with him. Pain lanced through his side as another bullet found its mark, but adrenaline kept him moving. He returned fire, careful shots meant to disable rather than kill, but in the chaos of the moment, he couldn't be sure of his accuracy. "Run," he told the boy during a brief lull in the shooting. "Get home." Now, the child hesitated only a moment before scrambling away, darting between buildings toward the edge of town. Kieran provided covering fire, exposing himself just long enough to ensure the boy's escape. That moment of distraction cost him dearly. The leader's bullet caught him square in the chest, knocking him backward into the dust. The world narrowed to the blue sky above him and the searing pain in his chest. He could hear shouts, more gunfire, then running footsteps fading away. His vision began to darken at the edges, consciousness slipping away despite his efforts to remain awake. The last thing Kieran saw before darkness claimed him was a woman's face, framed by honey blonde hair, leaning over him with worry etched into features that might have been beautiful in other circumstances. Her lips moved, but he couldn't hear her words as the world faded to black. Hannah Jackson had been at the Mercantile when the shooting started. Her first thought was for her son, Tommy, who had slipped away while she was speaking with Mr. Peterson about extending credit for supplies they desperately needed. When she heard the first shot, her heart nearly stopped. running into the street, heedless of the danger. She'd arrived just in time to see a stranger, a tall man with dark hair and a rangy build, take a bullet that was surely meant for her boy. Tommy had already disappeared down an alleyway, but the stranger lay bleeding in the street as the men who'd been pursuing her son fled at the approach of the sheriff. Hannah knelt beside the wounded man, pressing her hands against the wound in his chest, feeling his life seeping through her fingers. "Stay with me," she pleaded, though she'd never seen him before. "Please, you saved my boy." Sheriff Dawson arrived moments later, kneeling on the stranger's other side. "He's still breathing," the lawman noted with surprise. "But not for long without proper care. We need to get him to Doc Wilson's." Together with two other townsmen, they carried the unconscious man to the doctor's small office at the end of the street. Hannah followed, her hands and dress stained with his blood, her thoughts racing between gratitude that Tommy had escaped and fear for the man who had made that possible. "It was the Morgan boys and Russell Jenkins," Hannah explained to the sheriff as they waited outside the doctor's surgery. "They've had it in for us since Edward died. They think we owe them money." Sheriff Dawson nodded grimly. "Jenkins has been looking for trouble for months. But taking it out on a child, that's a new low." Inside the surgery, Doc Wilson worked furiously to save the stranger's life. The bullet had entered just below his collarbone, narrowly missing his heart but causing significant damage nonetheless. The doctor extracted the lead ball, cleaned and stitched the wound, then turned his attention to the less serious injury on the man's arm. "He's lucky," Wilson told Hannah when he finally emerged, wiping blood from his hands. "An inch to the right and he'd have been beyond my help. As it is, he's lost a lot of blood and fever is the next concern." "Will he live?" Hannah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If infection doesn't set in and if he has the will to fight, yes." The doctor studied her thoughtfully. "Do you know him?" Hannah shook her head. "Never seen him before today, but he saved Tommy from those men, took a bullet meant for my boy." Her voice broke slightly on the last words. "Well, he can't be moved for at least a week, maybe longer," Wilson said. "I've got other patients to tend to. Someone will need to stay with him, change his dressings, get him to drink when he can." Without hesitation, Hannah said, "I'll do it. It's the least I can offer after what he did for Tommy." For 3 days, the stranger hovered between life and death, his body burning with fever as Hannah bathed his forehead with cool cloths and spooned water between his cracked lips. Tommy came to sit beside her, his young face solemn as he watched the man who had saved him fight for his own life. "Is he gonna die, Ma?" Tommy asked on the second night, his voice small in the quiet room. Hannah smoothed her son's sandy hair. "Not if I have anything to say about it," she answered with more conviction than she felt. "He's strong and he has something to live for now." "What's that?" She smiled slightly. "Our gratitude." On the 4th day, the fever broke. The stranger's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of a winter sky, a pale, startling blue that seemed to look right through Hannah as she bent over him. "Where?" he managed, his voice a rasp of dry leaves. "You're in Gunnison," Hannah told him, offering a cup of water. "In the doctor's office. You've been here 4 days." He drank carefully, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. When he'd had his fill, he leaned back against the pillow, studying her face. "The boy," he asked, "safe?" "Thanks to you." Hannah felt tears welling in her eyes and blinked them back. "You saved my son's life. Those men, they wouldn't have stopped at a beating." The man closed his eyes briefly, relief visible in the slight relaxation of his features. "Good. I'm Hannah Jackson," she said. "The boy you saved is my son, Tommy." He seemed to consider for a moment whether to offer his own name. Finally, he said, Kieran McAllister." "Well, Mr. McAllister, it seems we owe you a debt we can never repay." A ghost of a smile crossed his pale lips. "No debt. Just happened to be in the right place." "The right place to nearly get yourself killed," Hannah corrected. "Doc Wilson says you'll need rest for at least another 2 weeks, maybe longer before you can travel." McAllister frowned at this news, clearly displeased by the prospect of such a long recovery. Hannah recognized the look of a man accustomed to being on the move, to whom stillness was an enemy to be avoided. "I don't suppose I have much choice," he conceded. "No, you don't," she agreed firmly. "Not unless you want to undo all my hard work keeping you alive these past few days." That earned her another faint smile. "Been sitting with me, have you?" "Someone had to make sure you didn't die in your sleep," Hannah replied, her tone lighter than she felt. The truth was she'd barely left his side, catching only brief moments of rest in the chair beside his bed, sending Tommy home each night with their neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. Before McAllister could respond, the door opened to admit Tommy, who hesitated at the threshold when he saw the man was awake. Hannah beckoned him forward. "Tommy, this is Mr. McAllister, the man who helped you." The boy approached the bed cautiously, clutching his hat in both hands. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice barely audible, "for saving me from those men." McAllister studied the child thoughtfully. "You want to tell me what that was all about?" Tommy glanced at his mother, then back at the wounded man. "Mr. Jenkins said my pa owed him money, said I could work it off or pay with a hide tanning." He swallowed hard. "I told him pa was dead and couldn't pay nobody nothing." That made him real mad. Hannah placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "My husband Edward died last winter, pneumonia. These men have been making claims against our property ever since, saying Edward borrowed money from them, but there was never any proof, and Edward. He would have told me." McAllister nodded slowly, taking in this information. "And the sheriff, what's his stance on all this?" "Sheriff Dawson does what he can," Hannah replied, her tone suggesting she found it insufficient. "But Jenkins has friends on the town council, powerful friends, I see." McAllister shifted slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. "Well, I don't imagine they'll bother the boy again anytime soon, not after what happened." "No," Hannah agreed. "They'll be more careful now, but they won't forget either." For a moment, the room fell silent, each of them contemplating the situation from their own perspective. Finally, Hannah straightened her shoulders and managed a smile. "But that's a problem for another day. Right now, you need to rest and recover, Mr. McAllister. Tommy and I will look in on you later." As they prepared to leave, McAllister called out, "Mrs. Jackson." When she turned back, he asked, "What happened to the men, the ones who were shooting at us?" Her expression hardened slightly. "Jenkins took a bullet in the leg. Nothing serious, according to the doctor. The others weren't hit. Sheriff Dawson has them in cells for now, but..." She shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its resignation. "Like I said, Jenkins has friends," McAllister nodded, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Thank you for telling me." After Hannah and Tommy departed, Kieran lay back, assessing his situation. His chest throbbed with every heartbeat, a constant reminder of how close death had come. But it wasn't the first time he'd faced mortality, nor was it the worst pain he'd endured. What troubled him more was the predicament of the widow and her son. He recognized the pattern all too well, powerful men taking advantage of a woman alone, especially one with property worth having. It was a story repeated across the frontier, and it rarely ended well for the woman unless she had protection. Hannah Jackson struck him as strong, but strength alone wasn't always enough against the kind of men who would threaten a child to get what they wanted. As Kieran drifted back to sleep, he told himself it wasn't his concern. He'd done his part, saved the boy, taken the bullets. Once he was well enough to ride, he'd move on, just as he always did. Attachment only led to pain, a lesson he'd learned at considerable cost. Yet something about Hannah's steady gaze and Tommy's solemn face lingered in his thoughts, following him even into dreams that were, for once, not filled with the nightmares of his past. 2 days later, Doc Wilson pronounced Kieran well enough to be moved from the surgery to a proper bed. "Mrs. Jackson has offered to put you up at her place," the doctor informed him. "She's got a spare room, and frankly, it makes sense. She's been tending to you anyway, and I need this space for patients I can actually help." Kieran frowned at the idea. "I can pay for a room at the hotel." "Hotel's full up with a mining company's men," Wilson replied dismissively. "Besides, the Jacksons live just outside town, quieter there, better for healing." Though he was reluctant to impose further on the widow's generosity, Kieran found himself without viable alternatives. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Dawson and another man helped load him into Hannah's wagon. The short journey to her small ranch a painful ordeal that left him sweating and pale by the time they arrived. The Jackson place was modest, but well kept, a small house with a barn and corral, set against the backdrop of the mountains that bordered the valley. A few cattle grazed in a nearby pasture and chickens scratched in the yard. It wasn't much, but Kieran could see why men like Jenkins might covet it. The land was good, with water from a creek that ran along the eastern boundary, and enough flat ground for crops or grazing. Hannah had prepared the spare room with fresh linens and a pitcher of water on the bedside table. Tommy hovered nearby as the men carried Kieran in, his expression a mixture of curiosity and lingering worry. "Thank you, Sheriff," Hannah said as Dawson and his deputy prepared to leave. "We'll manage from here." Dawson nodded, then addressed Kieran. "You're lucky, McAllister." Not many men walk away after facing down Jenkins and his bunch. "When you're well enough, I'll need a formal statement from you about what happened." Kieran nodded, conserving his strength. After the lawman departed, Hannah helped him take some water and a dose of the laudanum the doctor had sent along for the pain. "You should rest now," she told him. "Dinner won't be for a few hours yet." As she turned to go, Kieran caught her wrist gently. "Mrs. Jackson," he began, his voice still rough from exertion. "I appreciate your kindness, but I don't want to be a burden. As soon as I'm able, I'll move on." Hannah's expression was unreadable for a moment, then she shook her head. "You took 2 bullets meant for my son, Mr. McAllister. In my book, that means you're welcome here as long as you need." Before he could respond, she slipped from the room, leaving Kieran to contemplate the ceiling and the unexpected turn his journey had taken. He'd ridden into Gunnison with no intention of staying more than a night or two. Now, it seemed, fate or more accurately, a bullet had other plans. Over the next week, Kieran's strength gradually returned. Though still confined largely to bed, he was able to sit up for longer periods and even make short, painful excursions to the porch when the weather was fine. Hannah proved to be a diligent nurse and a surprisingly good cook, bringing him meals that helped restore his strength far better than the standard fare he was accustomed to on the trail. Tommy, initially shy around the stranger, gradually became more talkative. He would sit with Kieran in the afternoons, asking questions about where he'd been and what he'd seen in his travels. Kieran found himself sharing carefully edited stories of his journeys, omitting the darker aspects of his past while still providing enough adventure to captivate the boy. "Were you in the war, Mr. McAllister?" Tommy asked one afternoon as he helped change the bandage on Kieran's arm, a task Hannah had assigned him to make the boy feel useful. Kieran stiffened slightly, memories flashing unbidden. "Yes," he answered simply. "Pa was too," Tommy continued, oblivious to Kieran's discomfort. "He didn't talk about it much, though. Ma said it gave him bad dreams." "Your ma's a wise woman," Kieran said quietly. "Some things are better left in the past." "Is that why you travel so much, because of things in the past?" The question, innocent as it was, cut close to truths Kieran preferred not to examine. He considered deflecting but found himself unwilling to lie to the earnest-faced boy. "Partly," he admitted. "Sometimes moving on seems easier than staying put." Tommy nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Ma says we might have to move on too if Mr. Jenkins keeps causing trouble. But she doesn't want to. This was Pa's place. He built it for us." Kieran frowned, disturbed by the thought of Hannah and Tommy being forced from their home. "Has Jenkins been around since I've been here?" Tommy shook his head. "Sheriff Dawson made him promise to stay away, but Ma says promises don't mean much to men like that." Again, Kieran found himself agreeing with Hannah's assessment. Men like Jenkins rarely gave up on something they wanted, especially if they believed they had a rightful claim to it, however dubious. "Tommy," Hannah's voice called from the main room of the house. "Have you finished helping Mr. McAllister? The chickens still need feeding." "Yes, Ma." Tommy hastily gathered the old bandages. "I'll be back tomorrow, Mr. McAllister. You can tell me more about California then." After the boy left, Kieran sat thinking about the situation. From what he'd gathered in casual conversation with Hannah and Tommy, Edward Jackson had purchased this land 3 years earlier, moving his family west from Illinois in search of opportunity. He'd worked hard, building the house and barn himself, starting with a small herd of cattle that he'd planned to expand. His death last winter had left Hannah with a half-realized dream and a 10-year-old son to raise alone. What remained unclear was the nature of Jenkins' claim on the property. Had Edward actually borrowed money from the man? Or was Jenkins simply taking advantage of a vulnerable widow, manufacturing a debt as a pretext to seize land he coveted? Kieran's contemplation was interrupted by Hannah's entrance, carrying a tray with a bowl of stew and fresh bread. "Tommy says you're feeling stronger today," she noted, setting the tray on his lap. "Strong enough to be useful, I hope," Kieran replied. "I'm not accustomed to sitting idle while others work." Hannah smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that caught Kieran off guard. He'd been aware, in an objective sense, that she was an attractive woman, but the genuine warmth of her smile highlighted features that hardship and worry had somewhat obscured. "There'll be time for that," she assured him. "Doc Wilson says you need at least another week before attempting anything strenuous." Kieran ate a spoonful of stew, savoring the rich flavor. "This Jenkins," he said after a moment. "What exactly does he claim your husband owed him?" Hannah's expression darkened slightly. $500. "A ridiculous sum that Edward would never have borrowed without discussing it with me first. He says Edward put up the land as collateral, but he's never produced any paper with Edward's signature. And yet the sheriff hasn't dismissed the claim outright. Like I said, Jenkins has friends. Powerful ones." Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "The truth is, Jenkins wanted this land before Edward ever bought it. His spread borders ours to the west, and our creek would give him water access he currently lacks. When Edward outbid him for the property, Jenkins swore he'd have it eventually. And now he sees his opportunity," Kieran concluded. Hannah nodded. "With Edward gone, he thinks I'll be easy to intimidate. Maybe I would be if it were just me, but I have Tommy to think about. This land is his inheritance, his future. I won't give it up without a fight." Kieran found himself admiring her determination. Too many women in her situation would have already sold out and moved on, especially after threats against their child. But Hannah Jackson clearly possessed a quiet strength that belied her gentle appearance. "What will you do?" he asked. She sighed, looking out the window toward the mountains. "Hold on as long as I can. Hope Jenkins eventually gives up or focuses his attention elsewhere." Her gaze returned to Kieran, a hint of vulnerability showing through her composed facade. "But truthfully, Mr. McAllister, I'm afraid he won't stop until he gets what he wants, and I don't know how long I can keep fighting him alone." The admission seemed to cost her something, a proud woman unused to acknowledging her limitations. Kieran felt a surprising surge of protectiveness toward her and Tommy, a feeling he'd deliberately avoided for years. "You're not alone right now," he said quietly. Her eyes met his, searching. "No," she agreed. "But you won't stay. You've already said as much." Kieran couldn't deny it. Staying in one place for too long went against every instinct he'd developed since the war. Yet for the first time in years, the thought of moving on didn't bring its usual sense of relief. "I'll stay until I'm certain you and Tommy are safe," he found himself promising. "After that, we'll see." Hannah's expression softened, a mixture of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more than you know." As she took his empty bowl and left the room, Kieran wondered what he was getting himself into. The smart move would be to heal up and ride out, leaving Gunnison and its troubles behind. But something about Hannah Jackson and her son had gotten under his skin, making it impossible to consider abandoning them to Jenkins' machinations. For better or worse, it seemed Kieran McAllister's wandering days were temporarily on hold. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Kieran was sitting on the porch, enjoying the crisp mountain air, when he spotted 3 riders approaching the house. His hand instinctively moved to his side, where his revolver would normally be holstered, before remembering he was unarmed and still weak from his injuries. Hannah emerged from the house at the sound of hoofbeats, wiping her hands on her apron. She tensed visibly at the sight of the riders. "Tommy," she called without taking her eyes from the approaching men, "go to the barn and stay there until I call for you." The boy, who had been collecting eggs from the chicken coop, quickly complied, darting across the yard to the relative safety of the barn. "Jenkins?" Kieran asked quietly as Hannah moved to stand beside his chair. She shook her head. "No, that's Silas Morgan Jenkins' foreman. The other 2 work for him." Her voice was steady, but Kieran could sense her unease. As the riders drew closer, Kieran assessed them with a practiced eye. Morgan was a big man, with a weathered face and cold eyes that surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of someone appraising livestock. His companions were younger, likely hired guns rather than ranch hands, judging by the way they carried themselves and the well-maintained weapons visible at their sides. "Mrs. Jackson," Morgan called as they reined in before the porch. "Fine morning, isn't it?" His gaze shifted to Kieran, narrowing slightly. "I see your houseguest is recovering nicely." "What do you want, Morgan?" Hannah asked, dispensing with pleasantries. The foreman smiled, the expression failing to reach his eyes. "Just passing by, thought I'd check how you're getting on." Mr. Jenkins was concerned after that unfortunate business in town. "Concerned?" Hannah's voice held a hint of steel. "The only thing Mr. Jenkins is concerned about is how quickly he can force me off my land." Morgan's smile faded. "Now, Mrs. Jackson, that's hardly fair. Mr. Jenkins has a legitimate claim that he's trying to resolve in a businesslike manner." "There's nothing legitimate about it," she retorted, "and threatening my son is hardly businesslike." The foreman glanced at his companions before continuing. "That was an unfortunate misunderstanding." The boy was in Mr. Jenkins' store, and there was some confusion about whether he'd paid for his purchases. "Your employer drew a gun on a 10-year-old, Kieran interjected quietly. "There's no misunderstanding possible there." Morgan's attention shifted fully to Kieran, his expression hardening. "And you are Kieran McAllister. Ah, the hero of the hour." Morgan's tone made the words an insult rather than a compliment. "You're a long way from wherever you came from, McAllister. Might be wise to remember that you're passing through. Local matters don't concern you." Kieran met the man's gaze steadily. "They concern me enough to take 2 bullets over them. That makes them my business now." A tense silence followed this declaration, broken only by the stamping of one of the horses. Finally, Morgan touched the brim of his hat. "Well, I've delivered Mr. Jenkins' regards. We'll be moving on." He turned his horse, then paused to add, "Oh, and Mrs. Jackson. Mr. Jenkins mentioned he'll be stopping by soon to discuss the debt personally. He's prepared to be quite generous in his terms, considering your situation." With that parting shot, the 3 men rode away, leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake. Hannah's hands were clenched tightly at her sides, her face pale with suppressed anger. "He's never given up, not for a moment," she said quietly. "Even when Edward was alive, Jenkins was always there, watching, waiting for an opportunity." Kieran stood carefully, ignoring the pull of stitches in his chest. "Come inside. We need to talk." Once they were seated at the kitchen table, Tommy safely occupied with chores in the barn, Kieran leaned forward, his expression serious. "Hannah," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I need you to be honest with me. Is there any possibility, any at all, that your husband did borrow money from Jenkins?" She started to shake her head immediately, then stopped, considering the question more carefully. "Edward handled most of our finances," she admitted. He didn't always tell me everything, especially if he thought it would worry me, but $500, that's an enormous sum. We never had that kind of money, not at once." "What about the deed to the property? Is it secure?" "Yes," she said with more confidence. "It's in both our names, registered properly with the county." Edward insisted on that, said if anything happened to him, he wanted to be certain Tommy and I were protected. Kieran nodded, thinking through the situation. "Jenkins is after your land, not money. If he had a legitimate claim, he would have taken it to court by now. The fact that he's resorting to intimidation suggests he knows his claim wouldn't stand up to legal scrutiny." "So what do we do?" Hannah asked, a hint of desperation in her voice. "I can't fight him forever, Kieran. Sooner or later, he'll find a way to take what he wants." "Not if we can prove he's lying about the debt," Kieran replied. "Did your husband keep records, letters, receipts, anything that might show his financial dealings?" Hannah nodded slowly. "Edward was methodical about such things. He has a strongbox with papers in it. I haven't gone through all of them since he died. It was too painful at first, and then there was so much work just keeping the place going." "We should look through them," Kieran suggested. "If Edward never borrowed from Jenkins, there might be something that proves it." For the next several hours, they sat at the kitchen table, going through the contents of Edward Jackson's strongbox. There were deeds, letters from family back east, a few small bank books showing modest deposits and withdrawals, and receipts for equipment and livestock purchased over the 3 years the Jacksons had lived in Gunnison. Nothing about Jenkins, Hannah said with a mixture of relief and frustration. No loan documents, no mentions of borrowing money at all, except a small amount from the bank when we first arrived. Kieran was examining a leather-bound journal that appeared to be Edward's personal record of ranch operations. Each entry was dated, with notations about cattle sales, crop yields, and expenses. Toward the back, he found entries from the months before Edward's death. "Look at this," he said, turning the book so Hannah could see. "Your husband made notes about Jenkins here." It seems Jenkins approached him several times about selling the property. Hannah read the entry, dated just 3 weeks before Edward fell ill. Jenkins came by again today, offered $1,000 for the entire spread, told him, as I have before, that the land isn't for sale at any price. He suggested I might regret that decision. I'm concerned about his tone, which seemed more threatening than businesslike. We'll speak to Sheriff Dawson tomorrow. She turned the page to read the next entry. Spoke with Dawson. He acknowledged Jenkins has a reputation for underhanded dealings, but says without proof there's little he can do. Advised me to be cautious but not overly concerned. Easy for him to say. The next entry is from a week later, Kieran noted, pointing to the page. Jenkins' men have been riding along our western boundary daily. When I approached them, they claim to be checking their own fences, but I suspect they're watching our movements. Hannah is worried, though she tries not to show it. I've taken to keeping my rifle closer at hand. Hannah's hand trembled slightly as she touched the page, her husband's neat handwriting a painful reminder of all she'd lost. Edward never mentioned any of this to me. He must have been trying to protect me from worry. Kieran closed the journal gently. This confirms what we suspected. Jenkins wanted your land and was willing to use intimidation to get it. After Edward died, he saw his opportunity and invented this debt as a way to force you off the property legally. But how do we prove it? Hannah asked. It's just Edward's word against Jenkins, and Edward isn't here to speak for himself. We need more, Kieran agreed. Something that definitively shows Jenkins is lying about the loan. Tommy's voice called from outside, breaking into their discussion. "Ma, Ryder's coming." They exchanged a quick glance before Kieran rose, moving more stiffly than he would have liked toward the door. Hannah followed close behind, her face set in determined lines. This time, the approaching riders included Jenkins himself, a stocky man with graying hair and the florid complexion of someone who enjoyed his whiskey. Beside him rode Sheriff Dawson, looking uncomfortable, and 2 other men Kieran didn't recognize. "Stay inside," Kieran told Hannah quietly. "Let me handle this. It's my home," she countered. "I won't hide." Before they could argue further, Jenkins and his party reined in before the porch. The rancher's gaze flicked dismissively over Kieran before settling on Hannah. "Mrs. Jackson," he greeted her with false heartiness. "I've come to discuss our business. I see you've recovered your strength, McAllister. Good, you can witness our agreement." "There is no agreement," Hannah said firmly, "and there won't be one. My husband never borrowed money from you." Jenkins sighed dramatically. "I was afraid you might take this position. That's why I've brought Sheriff Dawson and Mr. Perkins from the bank." He gestured to one of the men Kieran didn't recognize. "Also, Mr. Howard, who's an attorney from Denver." The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles, nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Jackson, I've reviewed the documentation of the loan made to your husband. I'm afraid it appears quite legitimate." "What documentation?" Kieran demanded. "Let's see it." Jenkins reached into his coat and produced a folded paper which he handed to Sheriff Dawson. "See for yourself." A promissory note for $500, signed by Edward Jackson, with this property listed as collateral. Dated last September. Dawson brought the document to Hannah, who took it with trembling hands. Her eyes widened as she examined it. This is Edward's signature," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But he never told me about any loan. It doesn't make sense." Kieran took the paper from her, studying it carefully. The signature did appear genuine, matching other examples he'd seen in Edward's journal. The terms were clearly stated $500 to be repaid within 1 year, with the ranch as security against default. Why would Edward borrow such a sum without telling his wife? Kieran asked, directing the question to Jenkins. And what was the money for? Jenkins shrugged. That's hardly my concern. A man's business is his own. Perhaps he had debts elsewhere or investments that didn't pan out. The fact remains he signed the note, took the money, and failed to repay it before his death. Convenient timing, Kieran observed. Jenkins' eyes narrowed. Careful, McAllister. That sounds dangerously close to an accusation. Just an observation, Kieran replied mildly. Edward falls ill shortly after you begin pressuring him to sell, then dies without ever mentioning a substantial loan to his wife. And now you produce a document giving you claim to exactly what you've wanted all along. The attorney, Howard, cleared his throat. Mrs. Jackson, Mr. Jenkins has been patient, but the loan is now 6 months overdue. He's within his rights to foreclose on the property immediately. However, in recognition of your situation, he's prepared to offer you a month to vacate, plus a small stipend to help you relocate. How generous, Kieran remarked sardonically. Hannah had gone pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I need time to consider this. To look through Edward's papers more thoroughly. Of course, Jenkins agreed, though his expression suggested he considered it a waste of time. You have until the end of the week. Then I'll expect your decision. Either repay the full amount with interest or accept my terms for vacating. As they prepared to leave, Kieran noticed Tommy watching from the corner of the barn, his young face a mixture of fear and anger. The sight strengthened Kieran's resolve. Whatever game Jenkins was playing, he couldn't be allowed to succeed. After the visitors departed, Hannah sank onto the porch steps, the promissory note clutched in her hand. It's his signature, she said, still sounding bewildered. I'd know it anywhere, but why would he hide this from me? We told each other everything. Kieran sat beside her, ignoring the discomfort from his healing wounds. Maybe the question isn't why Edward would hide it, but whether he actually signed it knowingly. She looked up sharply. You think it's a forgery? Not exactly. But there are ways to get a man's signature on a document without him realizing what he's signing, especially if the text is added later above a signature obtained for some other purpose. Hope flickered in Hannah's eyes. How do we prove that? Kieran considered the problem. We need to find out if Edward signed anything else for Jenkins around that time, something legitimate that might have been altered. Hannah straightened suddenly. The grazing rights. Last fall, Jenkins approached Edward about allowing some of his cattle to graze on the north section of our land during the winter. They drew up an agreement. I remember Edward mentioning it. Would he have kept a copy? Yes, in the strongbox, but I didn't see it when we were looking earlier. They returned to the kitchen, emptying the contents of the strongbox onto the table once more. After a thorough search, Hannah sat back, frustrated. It's not here, but I'm certain Edward would have kept it. He kept everything related to the ranch. Could it be somewhere else? Maybe his desk or another safe place, Hannah considered, then stood abruptly. His Bible. Edward sometimes used it to store important documents. She hurried to a shelf in the main room and returned with a leather-bound Bible, its pages well worn from use. Opening it carefully, she leafed through until she found what she was looking for, a folded paper tucked between the pages of Psalms. Here it is, she said triumphantly. The grazing agreement with Jenkins. Kieran took the document and compared it side by side with the promissory note Jenkins had produced. The paper appeared to be the same type, and Edward's signature at the bottom of each was identical in its formation, too identical. Look at this, Kieran said, placing the documents next to each other. The signatures match perfectly, not just similar but exactly the same down to every curve and dot. Hannah studied them, her brow furrowed. Is that unusual? Very. No one signs their name exactly the same way twice. There are always tiny variations. Kieran tapped the promissory note. This signature was copied from the grazing agreement, probably traced, then the rest of the document was created around it. So Edward never borrowed money from Jenkins at all, Hannah said, her voice strengthening with certainty. It's a forgery, just as I thought. A clever one, Kieran agreed, but not clever enough. With this evidence, and your husband's journal entries about Jenkins' harassment, we should be able to convince Sheriff Dawson to dismiss Jenkins' claim. Hannah's relief was palpable. Thank you, Kieran. Without your help, I might have lost everything. Impulsively, she leaned forward and embraced him, the sudden contact catching Kieran off guard. For a moment, he remained still, unused to such displays. Then, carefully, he returned the embrace, aware of a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with his healing wounds. When Hannah pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, and she didn't quite meet his eyes. I should start dinner, she said, rising quickly. Tommy will be hungry after his chores. Kieran watched her move about the kitchen, struck by the realization that somewhere along the way, his commitment to helping Hannah and Tommy had become more than just repaying a debt or righting a wrong. He found himself genuinely caring what happened to them, an attachment he hadn't allowed himself to form with anyone since the war. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Early the next morning, Kieran rode into town with Hannah to present their evidence to Sheriff Dawson. The journey was painful for Kieran, whose wounds were still tender, but he refused to let Hannah go alone. Tommy remained at the ranch with strict instructions to stay near the house and keep Edward's old rifle close at hand, just in case. The sheriff's office was a small, sturdy building on Gunnison's Main Street. Dawson was at his desk when they entered, looking up with surprise at the sight of Kieran on his feet. McAllister, he greeted him. Doc Wilson know you're up and about? Probably not, Kieran admitted. But this couldn't wait. Hannah placed the documents on Dawson's desk, explaining what they'd discovered about the forged promissory note. The sheriff examined the papers carefully, comparing the identical signatures. This is serious, he said finally, looking troubled. Forgery is a serious crime. Jenkins is a powerful man in this county, Mrs. Jackson. Making such an accusation against him won't be taken lightly. We're not making accusations without proof, Kieran pointed out. The evidence is right in front of you, Dawson sighed, rubbing his jaw. I'll need to consult with the judge. He's not due back in Gunnison for another 2 weeks. We don't have 2 weeks, Hannah replied urgently. Jenkins gave me until the end of the week to decide whether to repay the loan or vacate my property. I'll speak to him, Dawson promised. Explain that there are questions about the validity of his claim that need to be resolved before any action can be taken. Kieran wasn't convinced the sheriff would stand firm against Jenkins' pressure, but it was a start. They left the documents with Dawson, who promised to keep them secure until the judge could review them. As they were leaving the sheriff's office, a commotion further down the street caught their attention. A group of men had gathered outside the saloon, their voices raised in anger. Among them, Kieran recognized Silas Morgan, Jenkins' foreman. Let's go, he said quietly to Hannah, taking her elbow to guide her toward their wagon. Whatever's happening there, we don't need to be involved. But before they could reach the wagon, Morgan spotted them and called out, McAllister. Just the man we were discussing. The group turned as one, several faces displaying open hostility. Morgan approached, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. Word is you're causing trouble for Mr. Jenkins, the foreman said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Encouraging Mrs. Jackson to fight a legitimate debt with false accusations. Kieran kept his expression neutral, aware that they were drawing a crowd. Any dispute between Mrs. Jackson and your employer is a legal matter, Morgan, to be settled by the courts, not in the street, Morgan sneered. Big words from a drifter who's been living off a widow's charity. What's your stake in this, McAllister? Found yourself a comfortable situation and don't want to move on. The implication was clear, and Kieran felt Hannah stiffen beside him. Before he could respond, another voice cut in. That's enough, Morgan. Sheriff Dawson had emerged from his office, drawn by the rising voices. Take your men and clear out. Public disturbances won't be tolerated. Morgan hesitated, clearly weighing his options before touching his hat brim in mock deference. Just having a friendly conversation, Sheriff. His gaze shifted back to Kieran, all pretense of friendliness gone. We'll continue at another time, McAllister. As Morgan and his men dispersed, Dawson approached Kieran and Hannah. You two should head back to your ranch, he advised quietly. Things are getting tense in town. I'll ride out later to let you know what Jenkins says about the documents. They took his advice, climbing into Hannah's wagon and heading out of town. Neither spoke for several minutes, both processing the confrontation and its implications. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Hannah said finally, breaking the silence. Kieran couldn't disagree. "Jenkins won't give up easily. He's invested too much in this scheme to back down at the first sign of resistance. Are you sorry you got involved?" she asked, not looking at him as she guided the horses along the rutted road. The question gave Kieran pause. By all rights, he should be. His plan had been to move on as soon as he was able, to continue the solitary existence that had been his choice since the war. Instead, he'd allowed himself to be drawn into a land dispute with a powerful, unscrupulous man, the kind of entanglement he'd carefully avoided for years. Yet looking at Hannah's profile, determined despite the worry evident in the set of her shoulders, Kieran realized he wasn't sorry at all. "No," he answered simply. "I'm not sorry." She glanced at him then, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. "Good, because I'm not sure how I'd manage this without you." The admission seemed to cost her something Hannah Jackson wasn't a woman accustomed to acknowledging she needed help. That she'd said it aloud to him felt significant in a way Kieran wasn't entirely ready to examine. When they arrived back at the ranch, they found Tommy waiting anxiously on the porch, rifle in hand. The boy's relief at seeing them was evident in the way his small shoulders relaxed. "Everything all right here?" Hannah asked, embracing her son. Tommy nodded. "Nobody came by, but I kept watch like you said." "Good man," Kieran told him, ruffling the boy's hair. "You did exactly right." The rest of the day passed quietly, though there was an undercurrent of tension as they waited for word from Sheriff Dawson. Kieran used the time to continue regaining his strength, walking the perimeter of the ranch buildings and checking the security of doors and windows. His wounds still pained him, but he pushed through it, knowing that if trouble came, Hannah and Tommy would need him at his best. Evening fell with still no sign of Dawson. Kieran insisted on taking the first watch while Hannah and Tommy slept, promising to wake her for the second half of the night. Sitting on the porch with Edward's rifle across his lap, Kieran contemplated how thoroughly his life had changed in the space of 2 weeks. From a drifter with no attachments to a man willing to face down a powerful enemy for the sake of a widow and her son, it was a transformation he hadn't sought and wasn't entirely comfortable with. Yet when he tried to imagine riding away, leaving Hannah to face Jenkins alone, he found he couldn't do it. Somewhere in the quiet hours of tending his wounds, in the shared meals and conversations, in Tommy's eager questions and Hannah's quiet strength, Kieran had found something he thought he'd lost forever: a sense of purpose, of belonging. It terrified him almost as much as it comforted him. Dawn was breaking when the sound of approaching riders drew Kieran's attention. He'd allowed Hannah to sleep through the night, finding himself unwilling to disturb her rest. Now he stood, ignoring the protest from his healing chest wound, and squinted at the figures approaching through the morning mist. It was Sheriff Dawson, accompanied by a deputy. Their expressions as they dismounted told Kieran their news wasn't good. "McAllister," Dawson greeted him, removing his hat. "Is Mrs. Jackson awake? I'll get her," Kieran replied, handing Edward's rifle to the deputy before entering the house. Hannah was already up, kindling a fire in the kitchen stove. She looked up questioningly when Kieran entered. "Sheriff Dawson's here," he told her. "With his deputy." She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron before following him outside. Tommy, awakened by the voices, trailed after them, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Sheriff," Hannah greeted Dawson with cautious formality. "You have news." Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "I spoke to Jenkins yesterday, showed him the documents. He claims the grazing agreement was drawn up later, using the promissory note as a template. That's why the signatures match." "That's ridiculous," Hannah protested. "Edward signed the grazing agreement in October. I was there." "Jenkins says different," Dawson sighed heavily. "And he has witnesses. His lawyer and the bank manager both claim they were present when Edward signed the loan document in September." Kieran's jaw tightened. "They're lying." "They're in on the scheme." "Maybe so," Dawson acknowledged. "But without proof, it's just your word against theirs. And you," he nodded at Kieran, "weren't even here when all this happened." So you're just going to let Jenkins take my home based on a forged document?" Hannah demanded, her voice rising with indignation. The sheriff had the grace to look ashamed. "I've convinced him to wait for the judge to return before taking any action. That gives you 2 weeks to either come up with the money or find more concrete evidence that the loan document is fraudulent." "And if we can't?" Kieran asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then the law will have to recognize Jenkins' claim," Dawson said grimly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Jackson, I truly am." After the sheriff and his deputy departed, Hannah stood motionless in the yard, her face pale but composed. Tommy pressed against her side, looking up at her with worried eyes. "Are we going to lose our home, Ma?" he asked in a small voice. Hannah knelt to embrace him. "Not if I can help it," she promised, though Kieran could hear the strain beneath her reassuring tone. Later, after Tommy had been sent to collect eggs, Hannah and Kieran sat at the kitchen table, discussing their options. 2 weeks isn't much time," Kieran observed. "Even if we could raise $500, which seems unlikely, paying Jenkins would only validate his fraudulent claim." Hannah nodded, pushing a strand of hair back from her face with a weary gesture. "We need to prove the loan document is a forgery. But how? Jenkins has clearly covered his tracks well, and he has the bank manager and a lawyer backing his story." Kieran considered the problem. "We need to find someone who was with Edward in September, someone who might know if he actually took out a loan or had dealings with Jenkins around that time. Most of our friends are other small ranchers, people in the same position. We are struggling to make ends meet. Edward wouldn't have gone to them for such a large sum." Hannah thought for a moment. "But he did make a trip to Denver in early September. He was gone for nearly a week selling cattle. Who would he have stayed with in Denver or done business with? His cousin lives there, Martin Jackson. They were close, grew up together in Illinois. If Edward needed money, Martin is the one he would have approached first, not Jenkins." Kieran nodded, a plan forming. "Then that's our next step. I'll ride to Denver, speak with Martin. If Edward confided in him about financial troubles or mentioned any dealings with Jenkins, it might give us the evidence we need." Hannah looked alarmed. "You can't make that journey yet. You're barely healed enough to ride into town, let alone all the way to Denver and back." "We don't have much choice," Kieran pointed out, "and I'm stronger than I look." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but you'll need to know exactly where to find Martin and what questions to ask." For the next hour, they planned the journey. Martin Jackson owned a successful mercantile in Denver and lived above the store with his family. Hannah wrote a letter of introduction, explaining the situation and asking for Martin's help in establishing whether Edward might have borrowed from Jenkins. "I should come with you," Hannah said as Kieran prepared to leave the next morning. "Martin knows me. He'd be more likely to speak freely." "Someone needs to stay with Tommy," Kieran reminded her, "and to keep an eye on Jenkins and his men. They might try something while I'm gone." She knew he was right but didn't like it. "Be careful," she said, handing him a packet of food for the journey. "Denver's a long ride and you're still not fully recovered." "I'll be fine," he assured her, touched by her concern. "Keep your doors locked at night and don't hesitate to use that rifle if necessary." Tommy watched wide-eyed as Kieran checked his revolver and slid it into his holster. "Are you coming back?" the boy asked bluntly. Kieran knelt to look him in the eye. "Yes, I promise." "Take care of your mother while I'm gone." Tommy nodded solemnly. "I will." The journey to Denver was arduous, Kieran's healing wounds protesting every mile. What should have been a 2-day ride took him nearly 4, his strength not yet equal to long hours in the saddle. By the time he reached the city, he was exhausted and in considerable pain, but determined to find Martin Jackson without delay. The mercantile was easy to locate, a well-established business on one of Denver's busier streets. Martin Jackson proved to be a robust man in his 40s, with a friendly manner that reminded Kieran somewhat of Edward as Hannah had described him. After reading Hannah's letter, Martin ushered Kieran into the living quarters above the store, where his wife served them coffee and fresh bread. "I was devastated to hear about Edward's passing," Martin said, shaking his head sadly. "He was more brother than cousin to me. Hannah's letter mentions some trouble with a man named Jenkins." Kieran explained the situation, showing Martin the copy of the promissory note that Hannah had made for this purpose. Martin examined it carefully, his expression darkening. Edward never mentioned borrowing money from anyone in Gunnison, he stated firmly. In fact, quite the opposite. When he was here last September, he was in good spirits. The cattle sale had gone well, and he was optimistic about the ranch's future. Did he mention Jenkins at all? Kieran asked. Martin thought for a moment. Yes, but not in the context of a loan. He mentioned that Jenkins had been pressuring him to sell the ranch, making offers that Edward found insultingly low. Edward was amused by it, said he'd told Jenkins he'd never sell, especially not to him. Would Edward have kept records of the cattle sale? Something that might show he had no need to borrow money at that time. Absolutely. Edward was meticulous about such things. Martin rose and went to a desk in the corner, rummaging through a drawer. He always sent me copies of his major transactions, in case anything happened to his own records. We'd been doing business together for years, even before he moved west. After some searching, Martin produced a ledger book. Here we are, September 12th of last year. Edward sold 18 head of cattle to the Thompson Meatpacking Company for a total of $630. Kieran leaned forward eagerly. That's more than the amount Jenkins claims Edward borrowed. Indeed, Martin agreed. And here's the receipt from the bank showing Edward deposited $500 upon his return to Gunnison on September 18th. He handed Kieran a copy of the bank document. He kept some cash for expenses and sent the rest home with him. This was exactly what they needed, proof that Edward had no reason to borrow money from Jenkins just days after returning from a profitable cattle sale. And the bank receipt directly contradicted the promissory note, which was dated September 15th. Edward couldn't have signed a loan document in Gunnison on the 15th when he was still here in Denver, Martin pointed out. This proves Jenkins is lying. Kieran felt a surge of triumph. With this evidence, even Sheriff Dawson would have to acknowledge that Jenkins' claim was fraudulent. There's something else, Martin added, his expression grave. Edward mentioned in his last letter to me, sent just weeks before he fell ill, that he suspected Jenkins might be behind some trouble at the ranch missing cattle, a fire in one of the pastures that seemed deliberately set. He was going to speak to the sheriff about it, but he wasn't optimistic anything would be done. Did he say why? Jenkins has connections not just in Gunnison, but at the territorial level. His brother-in-law is a judge in Colorado Springs, and he has business partnerships with several influential men in Denver. This explained why Jenkins had been so confident in his scheme. He believed his connections would protect him, even if Hannah fought back. Armed with Martin's testimony and the documents proving Edward's financial situation, Kieran prepared to return to Gunnison. Martin insisted he stay one more night to rest before the journey, an offer Kieran gratefully accepted. His wounds had reopened slightly during the ride, and he knew he needed to conserve his strength for what was to come. The return journey was slower than Kieran would have liked. A late spring storm delayed him in the mountains, forcing him to take shelter for nearly a day. By the time he reached the outskirts of Gunnison, almost a week had passed since he'd left Hannah and Tommy. As he approached the Jackson Ranch, an uneasy feeling settled over him. The house was dark, though it was only early evening. No smoke rose from the chimney, and there was no sign of activity in the yard. Drawing his revolver, Kieran approached cautiously. The front door stood slightly ajar, and when he pushed it open, he found the interior in disarray, furniture overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor, clear signs of a hasty search. "Hannah," he called, fear tightening his chest. Tommy, only silence answered him. Moving from room to room, he found the same destruction but no blood or other signs of violence. Whatever had happened here, Hannah and Tommy had either left willingly or been taken without a struggle. On the kitchen table, partially buried under scattered papers, Kieran found a note addressed to him in Hannah's handwriting. Kieran Jenkins came with the sheriff and several men. They claimed to have a court order giving them possession of the ranch. The sheriff said the judge arrived early and ruled in Jenkins' favor without waiting for your return. "We are staying with the Petersons in town until you return." Please come to us there as soon as you can. Be careful. Jenkins' men are watching the ranch." Hannah's relief that they were safe mingled with rage at Jenkins' duplicity. The judge couldn't have ruled legitimately without hearing all the evidence, which meant Jenkins had either lied about the court order or had corrupted the legal process entirely. Carefully avoiding being seen, Kieran left the ranch and made his way into town. The Peterson home was a small but neat house near the church. When Mrs. Peterson answered his knock, her expression was a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Thank goodness you're back," she said, ushering him inside. Hannah's been beside herself with worry. Hannah rose from her seat by the fire when Kieran entered, crossing the room quickly to embrace him before seeming to remember herself and stepping back. "You're hurt," she said, noticing the way he held himself stiffly. "Just tired," he assured her, though in truth the ride had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. "Where's Tommy?" "Asleep in the back room. He's been having nightmares since we were forced out." Her voice trembled slightly, the only sign of the strain she was under. When they were seated, Hannah told him what had happened. 3 days after Kieran left for Denver, Jenkins had arrived with Sheriff Dawson, a man claiming to be the circuit judge, and several armed men. They presented what appeared to be a court order granting possession of the ranch to Jenkins in satisfaction of the debt. "I told them you'd gone to Denver to get evidence proving the loan was fraudulent," Hannah explained. The judge said it didn't matter, that the time for presenting evidence had passed. He gave us an hour to collect our personal belongings before they took possession. "That wasn't the real judge," Kieran said grimly. "It was all part of Jenkins' scheme. I met with Edward's cousin in Denver. We have proof that Edward couldn't have signed that loan document when Jenkins claims he did." Hope flared in Hannah's eyes. "So we can fight this, get our home back." "Yes, but we'll need to move quickly. The real judge should be arriving soon if he hasn't already. We need to present our evidence to him before Jenkins can further corrupt the process." Mrs. Peterson, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "The circuit judge arrived yesterday. I saw him going into the courthouse this morning." Kieran nodded. "Then we'll see him first thing tomorrow. For now, you both should get some rest." Despite the urgency of their situation, Kieran insisted Hannah sleep while he kept watch. The events of the past week had clearly exhausted her, and they would need their wits about them when confronting Jenkins and his allies. The next morning, they made their way to the small courthouse onGunnison's Main Street. The circuit judge, a stern-faced man named Hollister, was initially reluctant to hear their case, stating that he had already ruled on the matter. "With respect, Your Honor," Kieran said firmly, "you did not." Someone impersonating a judge issued that ruling as part of a scheme by Russell Jenkins to defraud Mrs. Jackson of her property. This serious accusation caught Hollister's attention. "Those are grave charges, sir. Do you have evidence to support them?" Kieran presented the documents from Martin Jackson, explaining how they proved Edward couldn't have been in Gunnison on the date the promissory note was supposedly signed. He also showed the judge the identical signatures on the loan document and the grazing agreement, explaining their suspicion that Jenkins had forged the loan using Edward's signature from the legitimate contract. Judge Hollister examined the evidence carefully. "This certainly raises questions about the validity of Mr. Jenkins' claim," he acknowledged. "I'll need to speak with Sheriff Dawson and examine the original documents. Jenkins may try to dispose of the evidence now that we've challenged his claim," Hannah pointed out. "He's not above destroying anything that might incriminate him." The judge nodded grimly. "I understand. Deputy," he called to a young man standing near the door, "find Sheriff Dawson and bring him here immediately. Then go to Mr. Jenkins' ranch and request his presence, along with any documents related to this matter. Make it clear that failure to comply will be considered contempt of court." As they waited for Dawson and Jenkins to arrive, Kieran noticed Hannah watching him with an odd expression. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "I just realized," she replied, her voice equally low, "that I never properly thanked you for any of this. For saving Tommy, for helping us fight Jenkins, for riding all the way to Denver despite your injuries. Why are you doing all this, Kieran? You could have moved on weeks ago." The question caught him off guard, though he'd asked it of himself many times over the past weeks. The answer, when it came, surprised him with its simplicity. "Because you and Tommy matter to me," he said honestly. "And because for the first time in a long time, I feel like I belong somewhere." Hannah's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment Kieran thought he'd said too much. Then her hand found his, squeezing gently. "You do belong," she told him, "with us if you want to." Before Kieran could respond, the courthouse door opened to admit Sheriff Dawson, looking distinctly uncomfortable. The moment between Kieran and Hannah passed, but the warmth of her hand in his lingered, a promise to be explored when this was over. Dawson confirmed that he had never seen Judge Hollister issue a ruling on the Jackson property, admitting that the man who had presented himself as the judge was unknown to him, but that Jenkins had vouched for his identity. "And you didn't think to question this?" Hollister demanded, clearly angered by the deception. "A man presents himself as a circuit court judge with no credentials you recognize, and you accept it on the word of an interested party." Dawson had no good answer for this, his discomfort growing as the judge continued to question him. It became increasingly clear that while Dawson might not have been actively complicit in Jenkins' scheme, he had willfully overlooked suspicious circumstances out of deference to Jenkins' local influence. When Jenkins himself finally arrived, accompanied by his lawyer and the bank manager, his confident manner faltered at the sight of Kieran, and the documents spread before the judge. "Mr. Jenkins," Judge Hollister said coldly, "these people have presented compelling evidence that the promissory note you claim was signed by Edward Jackson is, in fact, a forgery. How do you respond to this accusation?" Jenkins blustered, denying any wrongdoing and insisting that Edward had indeed borrowed the money as claimed. But when confronted with the proof that Edward was in Denver on the date the note was supposedly signed in Gunnison, his story began to unravel. The bank manager, seeing which way the wind was blowing, suddenly developed a selective memory about witnessing Edward's signature. Jenkins' lawyer, more practiced in deception, maintained that there must be some misunderstanding about the dates, but Judge Hollister was not easily swayed. After reviewing all the evidence and hearing testimony from each party, he rendered his decision. "It is the finding of this court that the promissory note presented by Russell Jenkins is fraudulent, and that his claim against the property of Edward and Hannah Jackson is therefore invalid." He fixed Jenkins with a stern gaze. "Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into the matter of an individual impersonating a circuit court judge, a serious offense against the territory's legal system. Sheriff Dawson, you will take Mr. Jenkins into custody pending this investigation." Dawson looked startled but moved to comply, perhaps eager to redeem himself in the judge's eyes. Jenkins' face had gone pale with fury, his gaze locking on Kieran with naked hatred. "This isn't over, McAllister," he spat as Dawson approached to take his arm. "You're still a drifter, a nobody." "This isn't your fight." Kieran met his gaze steadily. "You made it my fight when you threatened people I care about," he replied quietly, "and I'm not drifting anymore." As Jenkins was led away, Hannah turned to Kieran, tears of relief shining in her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. "We can go home." Judge Hollister issued an immediate order restoring the Jackson Ranch to Hannah's possession, with deputies assigned to accompany them and ensure Jenkins' men vacated the property peacefully. By nightfall, Hannah and Tommy were back in their home, though the disorder left by Jenkins' search would take days to put right. Kieran worked alongside them, repairing what had been broken, restoring order to the chaos Jenkins had created. As days passed and turned into weeks, his wounds healed completely, and with them, some of the deeper injuries he'd carried since the war. The nightmares that had plagued him for years grew less frequent, replaced by dreamless sleep, and occasionally visions of a future he'd stopped believing was possible. Jenkins faced trial for fraud and conspiracy, his scheme exposed as even more extensive than they had imagined. It emerged that he had used similar tactics to acquire at least 2 other properties in the county, threatening and intimidating people who lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. With Jenkins' influence diminished, Other victims came forward, and the full extent of his crimes became clear. He was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, his assets seized to compensate those he had wronged. For Hannah and Tommy, life gradually returned to normal, or rather, a new normal that included Kieran's presence in their daily routine. He built a small cabin behind the main house, refusing to presume upon Hannah's hospitality by continuing to sleep under her roof, though he took most meals with the family and helped with the ranch work as if it were his own. Summer came, bringing with it the hard work of haying and tending to the small but growing herd of cattle. Kieran taught Tommy to ride properly and to handle a lariat, skills the boy absorbed eagerly. Hannah watched them together, seeing how naturally Kieran had stepped into the role Edward's death had left vacant, never trying to replace the father Tommy had loved, but offering a new kind of guidance and companionship. One evening in late August, almost exactly a year after Kieran had first ridden into Gunnison, he and Hannah sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Tommy had gone to bed, exhausted after a day of helping with the harvest. "I've been thinking," Kieran said after a comfortable silence, "about the future." Hannah turned to look at him, the fading light casting soft shadows across her features. "What about it? For a long time, I didn't think I had one, not a real one. Just more of the same riding from town to town, taking whatever work came along, never staying long enough to form attachments." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The war, it changed me, made me believe I wasn't meant for normal things like home and family." "And now?" Hannah asked softly. Kieran met her gaze. "Now I'm not so sure. Being here with you and Tommy, it's made me remember what it feels like to belong somewhere, to have people who matter." Hannah's hand found his, a gesture that had become familiar over the months. "You belong here, Kieran. You have since the day you stepped in front of those bullets for Tommy." He turned his hand to clasp hers more firmly. "I love you, Hannah," he said simply. "You and Tommy both. I think I have for a long time, but I was afraid to admit it, even to myself." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "We love you too, both of us." "I don't have much to offer," Kieran continued. "Just myself and a promise to always protect you and Tommy, to work beside you and make this place everything Edward dreamed it could be." Hannah moved closer, her free hand coming up to touch his face gently. "That's all we've ever wanted, just you here with us." When their lips met, it felt like the culmination of a journey neither had expected to take, yet both had been traveling toward since that fateful day in Gunnison. The kiss was tender at first, then deeper, speaking of promises and possibilities neither had dared voice until now. Later, as stars appeared in the darkening sky, Kieran remembered the words Hannah had spoken when he lay bleeding in the dusty street. Words he'd been too close to unconsciousness to hear at the time, but that Tommy had repeated to him months later. "Then you're ours now." She had claimed him in that moment of crisis, and unknowingly, he had claimed her and Tommy in return. Not as replacements for what he had lost, but as the beginning of something new, a family forged in adversity and strengthened by love. They were married 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony in Gunnison's small church with Tommy standing proudly beside them. Martin Jackson came from Denver for the occasion, bringing gifts and good wishes from Edward's extended family, all of whom welcomed Kieran warmly. Life wasn't perfect. The ranch demanded constant work, and there were still those in town who viewed Kieran with suspicion, the drifter who had settled down under unusual circumstances. But such concerns mattered little against the reality of their daily lives, the shared joys and challenges that bound them together. Winter came again, but this time Hannah faced it without fear, knowing she wasn't alone. The three of them sat before the fire on Christmas Eve, Tommy excitedly arranging the few gifts they'd been able to afford, Kieran's arm around Hannah's shoulders as she leaned against him. "Ma," Tommy said suddenly, looking up from his task, "is it all right if I call Kieran Pa now?" "Since he's married to you and everything?" Hannah glanced at Kieran, seeing the emotion that flickered across his face at the boy's question. "That's something you should ask Kieran," she replied gently. Tommy turned expectant eyes to the man who had saved his life and, in the process, become so much more than a hero from a chance encounter. "Would it be all right?" he asked. "If I called you Pa," Kieran swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'd be honored, Tommy. But you know your real father was a good man who loved you very much. I'd never want to take his place in your heart." "I know," Tommy said solemnly. "Ma says I can keep both of you in my heart, just in different places. There's room." "Your ma's a wise woman," Kieran agreed, his voice husky with feeling. Tommy returned to his arrangement of the gifts, satisfied with the resolution. Hannah pressed closer to Kieran, her head on his shoulder, her hand resting over the scar where Jenkins' bullet had nearly taken him from them before they'd truly found each other. "He's right, you know," she murmured. "There's room in our hearts for everything we've been and everything we're becoming. The past doesn't have to define the future." Kieran kissed the top of her head, marveling at how this woman and her son had healed wounds he'd thought would never close. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white, a clean page upon which to write the next chapter of their lives. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together not as a drifter, a widow and a fatherless boy, but as a family who had found each other against all odds and chosen to build something enduring from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. In the flicker of firelight, with Tommy's excited chatter and Hannah's warm presence beside him, Kieran McAllister finally laid to rest the restless spirit that had driven him from place to place for so many years. He was home, at last and forever.